Hello and welcome to the Byzantine Scotist. Today I'm going to be announcing a new project I'm working on a little bit. So I'll give people a few seconds to filter in and then I'll start up here. All right. There we go. We started. My excuse was I was getting stuff ready and starting up the dishwasher. So I think that's a good excuse, keeping my place somewhat clean. All right. So to announce this new project I'm working on a little bit, I'm working on actually creating a Catholic homeschool program for high schoolers. Now, why do I think that this is a necessary project? I've been going through and looking at lots of different programs that exist out there. The point of this stream is not to bash those programs or say they're not good or anything. Let's make sure my audio is coming in right. Yeah, so I think a lot of those programs have offered a lot of good, but I think that a lot of them could be better in that we have a very long tradition of theories of education within the Catholic Church. And I want to bring something that will offer, I think, the fullness of what we could be offering in Catholic education right now. And so I don't know how long it's going to take me to get this project off the ground. I'm not promising that anything will come soon. I was initially not actually going to publicize that I was working on this for a long time. And I was just sort of just going to work on it privately, talk to some people, but I had no idea for a stream today. And I thought maybe by putting this out here, I could get some feedback from people, hear some of their ideas, see if there would even be any interest in a program like this. So I'm going to pull up what I've been working on and see. Let's see. There we go. Can people see this well? Yeah. Can people see this just fine? Let me know in the chat. I'm going to see if I can. There we go. I can make that pull down. So as you can see here, I'm calling the program based on my idea for a name for it is St. Bonaventure Academy, basing it especially on St. Bonaventure. If you go back on my channel, when I was starting up this research project a few months ago, I made a video actually on St. Bonaventure's theory of education. And just to summarize that for people who haven't seen that video, the idea was essentially that every other area of study is meant to lead back to the study of theology, and it prepares us for the study of theology. And also, I think importantly, is what was I going to say? Yeah, he emphasizes the importance of the trivium and the quadrivium. And as we get into this here, we're going to see that the trivium and the quadrivium are frequently misunderstood by classical education now. And I don't mean to bash people who use it. I work within classical education. I think that there's a lot of great stuff going on within the classical education movement. My only thoughts are, here's where I think it could be even better than what we're doing right now. All right, so starting off, so my basic pitch for St. Bonaventure Academy is that St. Bonaventure is an online homeschool academy, which is Catholic, traditional, classical, and integrated. These are sort of the four main things that I want to push on that I think we could do well here. So what do I mean by these? So SBA is Catholic. This means that every single subject is infused with the Catholic faith. Our theology classes provide a very detailed catechesis. Every other subject is also taught from a Catholic perspective, right? So it's important that every single thing we're doing relates back to theology and the study of theology. Because everything comes from God, so everything proceeds back to God. SBA also recognizes the authority of the Catholic Church in its earthly head, the Holy Father, Pope Francis. Right? So if we're going to be doing any sort of Catholic education program, we have to make sure we're submitting to the magisterium, right? This is not the sort of thing where we just get to decide we're going to teach whatever we want and call it Catholicism. No, it's the magisterium that's the interpreter of Catholic teaching. So we have to be sure to submit to the teaching of the Catholic Church. And then, of course, non-Catholic students are entirely welcome at SBA, but parents should be aware of the Catholic content within its curriculum. And so, yeah, essentially, right, if you're non-Catholic, you're welcome to enroll, but hopefully if it's a good program, by the time you get out of it, you'll be Catholic. Then, traditional. The presentation of the Catholic faith at SBA is traditional. This does not mean we hate the Pope or Vatican II, right? Rejecting the authority of the church would not actually be traditional. But we recognize that the Catholic faith ought to be understood in the same sense it always has, right? So when we're teaching the faith, our books shouldn't just be new books. If you can't pick up old theology books and agree with what's in there, you're not teaching the Catholic faith. You're teaching something new that was invented recently. Our theology classes, therefore, are based on the teachings of the fathers and doctors of the church. Our science classes uphold the Catholic doctrine of creation and scholastic metaphysics. This is something I think people will be especially interested in as the way we're going to go through science, which I'll show when we get to that part of this whole program. We're going to uphold the Catholic doctrine of creation, right? So we're going to teach that the biblical story is the true story of history and understand how that integrates with science. But then also scholastic metaphysics. Very frequently, metaphysics and its implications on science are ignored within Catholic science programs. In looking about to see who has actually integrated metaphysics into their science programs, the only Catholic program I could find that hasn't, maybe I'm missing stuff, was Queen of Heaven Academy for their biology program was discussing how they discuss the soul within it. So I thought that was interesting. But I really want a program that's entirely infused from start to finish with correct philosophy. All right. So classical. SBA follows the method of education that all the saints practiced, the classical liberal arts, right? So the way that this program is going to work, hopefully, is actually having actually using the method of teaching, right? So it's not only the content that has to be different for a Catholic program, but actually the method in which we teach, as we're going to see. So what is this method? Right. The liberal arts are not stages of learning, but different skills that one must learn in order to use for anything else. SBA teaches all 7 classical liberal arts and teaches them in a classical manner. Right. So we have to teach all the liberal arts. So it's a lot of programs will say, oh, we teach the trivium. And then the quadrivium, they don't teach the quadrivium at all. No, we need to teach the quadrivium as well. It's just as important as the trivium. And the trivium is the 3 ways related to language arts. And quadrivium is the 4 ways related to the mathematical arts. And these are the skills that we use to study every other subject. These are not, as I said, stages of learning. So a lot of modern programs will follow Dorothy Sayers, where she gives a speech of the 3 stages of classical education. You start with grammar stage in elementary school, then the logic stage in middle school, and then the rhetoric stage in high school. But you probably do study grammar at most of these programs, but you probably nowhere in there study logic or actual rhetoric, right? These are just names we've given to already existing stages of development within modern education. And it's still fundamentally modern education that we've taken medieval names and slapped onto it. But it's not actually classical education. We want actual classical education. All right. So what are these then? The 3 language-based liberal arts are the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar is taught through a rigorous study of Latin grammar. And it's important that we actually understand it's important to study English grammar. I think I am going to have some study of English grammar, but it's hard to study grammar when it's in your own language. So by studying Latin, we're able to take a step back and really understand how language works. In their last year, students even learn to write Latin, requiring a very comprehensive knowledge of grammar. So I myself didn't really understand how English grammar worked until I learned how to write Latin. I think it's writing Latin that really helps someone master the skill of grammar. And so I think that that's very important. Now, mentioning here, as I'll get into in a little bit, they will only get to this writing Latin stage if they already come into the program with a basic reading comprehension of Latin. If they haven't come into high school with any Latin before that, of course, they're not going to reach that by 4 years of high school. There's simply no way you can reach that in that time. All right. Logic is taught through 2 years of classical logic. I think I actually changed this since I typed this up. It was actually now 1 year of logic. I'd like to fit in 2 years of logic. I just don't have anywhere in the program to do that. I'm thinking of using for logic this great book I found recently. Here, I'll put myself back up on the screen. The Trivium by Sister Miriam Joseph. It's actually a really great book on logic, and it starts off a little bit with grammar to show you the grammatical roots of logic. So logic nowadays is taught like a set of symbols we manipulate. But we'll notice this is not in the quadrivium, it's in the trivium. It's an element of language, so we can actually use logic. And she does a really good job of showing how our rules of both formal and material logic follow from the rules of grammar. And then at the end, she also touches on reading and comprehension a little bit in rhetoric. To show you how the rules of logic are actually useful, but the rules of logic are not comprehensive of everything you could use with language. And this logic is also utilized in many other classes as well. You need logic for everything else. And rhetoric is also given a full year and is through the traditional textbook, Aristotle's Rhetoric. Right, so rhetoric is what we it goes above and beyond simply proving something logically, but trying to convince them through other elements of style. And yes, the traditional textbook for this is Aristotle's Rhetoric, which lays out the basic elements of it. But I think it also needs to be supplemented with other stuff that will show how to have good rhetoric in the English language. All right. And rhetoric is reinforced through daily composition work in language arts classes. Right. So as they're in grammar, logic, or other classes, we also want to be reinforcing the skills of rhetoric by slowly building up the skills of rhetoric, as we're going to see, as I'll go into that in a little bit when I discuss the language arts portion. Right. The 4 mathematical liberal arts are the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Mathematics is taught in part through the traditional geometry textbook, Euclid's Elements. Right? This was a standard book that was used to teach mathematics, and it's still a very useful textbook. So we're still going to use that in our actual geometry class, work through at least the first 6 books of Euclid's Elements, which is really the core of it. This book is extremely rigorous and helps students develop their logic skills, right? So students will really see through this that the rules of mathematics aren't arbitrary rules we made up, but Euclid will show he never defends anything without having, he never introduces an argument without having first defended every proposition in that argument. So he starts with only a collection of axioms, things that are completely self-evident, and then builds up the rest of geometry through there by proving each element of it before he introduces the next. And so it's very useful for helping to have good geometry, other good logic skills as well. It'll help reinforce those logic skills. SBA also teaches the philosophical foundations of mathematics, a traditional part of arithmetic. Something we want to go through is the foundations of it and introduce, as we introduce each part, right, and as mathematics developed, the philosophy of how mathematics was structured changed over time. We want to discuss that and look at both more classical foundations for mathematics and more modern foundations and discuss the relationship between the two. Right. Well, most classical curriculums only include arithmetic and geometry. SBA also teaches music, which is essential to a properly musical view of the cosmos, and astronomy, the study of quantity and motion, as part of its mathematics curriculum. And so we're also going to teach these other important elements, right? How the music is structured, how the world is structured in this beautiful harmony created by God through the study of music and astronomy. This liberal arts-based math curriculum is far more rigorous and impressive to colleges than almost any secular STEM-based program, right? So people say, oh, this is so liberal arts-based. How am I going to get into a STEM program to get a real job? All right. If you've taken up through like differential calculus, right, multivariable calculus rather, you look not. There's a good chunk of American students who, first of all, have taken up through Calc 2. Even if you get to multivariable calculus, you still look the same as a significant number of people applying to these programs. But what if you come in and I've said, no, I've studied Euclid's Elements in the original. I've studied Newton's Principia in the original. If you get even far enough in this program, you can get to study set theory, something that's almost never covered until college mathematics. And so even though you might not have gone through a lot of the standard popular courses, I actually think that a program like this will make you stand out. And colleges will look at high school students who've done this work and will say, that's really interesting. And I think that will actually make this program very attractive for students wanting to go into STEM programs. They will not have the same resume as the million other students applying to the same program, right? If there's 10,000 students applying to a program, there's only 500 spots. You don't want to look like those other 10,000 students. You want to have something unique that you're offering. And I think that this program really offers something unique that could be put forward. All right, and then finally, integrated. All our classes are integrated. History, literature, theology, science, mathematics, language arts, and Latin are all connected to a 4-year curriculum walking chronologically through history and logically building up the philosophical foundations of a Catholic worldview. They do not feel like separate classes, but one class with many aspects, right? So very frequently, these classes are going to relate to each other that if you haven't taken another class, you won't know what you're doing in this current class, even if it's in a different sequence. They're going to draw on one another. So it's actually one curriculum, right? A curriculum has to have a series of steps to take you from a beginning point to an end point. As I go through this thing, I'm only going to be able to touch on a small number of the connections that I've been working on between these classes. They're going to be extremely integrated with one another. To the point where many of these classes, we're about to see the different subjects. I didn't know what category to put them in because they fit in multiple categories. All right. So they do not feel like separate classes, but one class with many aspects. This integrated approach provides students with the Catholic worldview. They will need to see the world properly. Right, so you're going to notice there's only a tiny bit of a course in apologetics here, but all that apologetics really is helping them refocus their logic and rhetoric. It's really all of these classes they're going to be taking that's going to shape them to a Catholic worldview so that when they go out there, they're not going to be believing materialism. They're not going to be believing atomism. They're not going to be believing that the world can be reduced to simple mathematical formulas. They're not going to believe that history is an arbitrary series of cause and effect and isn't guided by divine providence. When they are I know a lot of this stuff people would say this should be introduced in college. And yeah, some of it probably should be introduced in college. But we only have them in our households for a certain amount of time before we send these students out into the world. And a lot of these Catholic programs, unfortunately, aren't all that Catholic and are also very expensive. And so if I think you have this strong foundation, then they can go to even a local secular college and get the actual background they need to be able to study stuff, right? Be able to get a job in the world. And so they'll have a lot of this strong foundation here that they're going to need. And classes in different sequences frequently draw on one another. The study of the liberal arts, including mathematics, help provide students with the tools to study their other subjects, right? These are going to help train their minds that they can think and understand the other subjects. All right, so we're first going to take a brief overview of the whole curriculum, and then I'm going to go in and break down each subject here. Someone asked me about Wolfgang Smith's mathematical works. I haven't looked at his mathematical works. I've looked at some of his work on quantum physics, which I'm actually planning to integrate into the curriculum, and some of his works on cosmology, which will probably also be integrated into the curriculum. I think Wolfgang Smith is a great guy, even though if I don't agree with him on everything necessarily. All right, so our first section, history, literature, and theology. This was actually the original core I designed, was history, literature, and theology. And if I can't get the program fully off the ground initially, I may initially just design these 3 courses, get those off the ground, with recommendations of what students should be taking in other areas, and then go back and design a lot of that stuff. And if I'm going through this, and you hear about one of these classes, and you think you could really be of help in this class, absolutely reach out to me. I'm really looking for people who want to help with this project. So please reach out to me if any of this sounds interesting to you and you'd like to help. This is entirely something I'm doing as a hobby right now, so I completely cannot offer any pay for help right now whatsoever. But hopefully, if you are helpful and you can work in, if I can eventually get this off the ground as a real company, then absolutely we would work towards hiring you there. But as of right now, this is not a company. This is a hobby I'm doing in my free time. But if you're interested, please offer to help out. All right, so history, literature, and theology here, right? So history, we really want to study it in chronological order, right? So we want to do ancient history, then classical history, which is ancient history would be the ancient Near East. And then classical history would be the Greek and the Romans. And most programs, they do 2 years of modern history, early modern and then like recent modern, or they do world history and American history for modern. But I actually think that it's more important. American history you can absorb by being in the culture, but you don't need an American history course in high school. It's a complete waste of time. You could just include some American history within modern history. And if you want an American history course, put in one like 8th grade. I do eventually want to expand this to be middle and elementary school as well. But right now I'm focusing on the high school because I think that's the area where there's really needs to be a better program out there. I think that actually a lot of other programs are entirely sufficient for elementary and middle school. And I'll probably just have a recommended courses for elementary and middle school initially of other classes you can take that are already out there. Just do American history in 8th grade. That's all you need for American history. It's perfectly good. Because you ancient Near East. And the reason I want to do the ancient Near East as well is so you have enough time to cover the Old Testament and really get the historical context for the Old Testament. Because so many of these programs only study, if they study ancient history, it's only Greek and Latin with maybe a short touch on Mesopotamia and Egypt. But Mesopotamia and Egypt are extremely important for the historical context of the Old Testament. So it's important for us to cover those as well. And it's also important, though, to cover Greek and Roman history. The only program I found that does 2 years of ancient history is Colby Academy, but they do 1 year of Greek and 1 year of Roman, which I think is too much time on each of those civilizations. Well, I mean, ideally, if we had unlimited time, we'd spend 3 years on each of these classes listed here so we could really understand them. But unfortunately, we only have so many hours in the day, and so we can't do that right now. All right, then We do medieval history next, especially understanding it from a Catholic perspective, and then modern history. Then we're going to pair each of those history courses with a literature course to match up what was written at the time. So we'll get into these in a little bit. We're going to have ancient wisdom and epic to match ancient history, classical philosophy for classical history, on Dante and Shakespeare for medieval history, and then books, Christian books about the modern world, calling it the crisis of modernity for modern history. So I mentioned the high arts and culture. That will be integrated into all of this. So the literature, as you see as I go through the books, the literature will only be the best of literature. And there's lots of stuff I thought might be interesting for historical context, for example, in medieval history, but I decided to pick out the best of Christian literature written here. Also, in selecting literature, I have not selected books that are erroneous philosophically, but have good style. So you will not find Mark Twain anywhere in this curriculum. You will never find a Mark Twain book anywhere in any curriculum I ever designed, because his stuff is so horrible philosophically, even if it is of excellent literary style. Now, if you, in a college course, want to get into errors, right, stuff that is wrong, but we're going to read because it's good style or because we need to refute it, you can go read that in college. But in high school, these students are still being formed deeply, and so we should not be introducing them to erroneous literature. With a very slight exception in my ancient wisdom and literature and epic course, we do touch on some erroneous pagan literature, but it's mostly so we can see how the Bible refutes it. And I also don't think most students are going to be tempted to start worshiping the Babylonian gods, for example. You know, I think that's we're safe to introduce to them and refute. All right. And then to line up with theology. So ancient history, as we're studying that will set the context for the Old Testament. A classical history will set the context for the New Testament. Medieval history will set the context for dogmatic theology, and where all this theology is being systematized in the scholastic period. And then modern history, it's less of a direct theology course, but I wanted to include a course I'm calling civics. That basically the first semester will be the church's political philosophy and the Catholic social teaching. And the second semester will be an analysis of the American founding, setting it in light of Catholic philosophy. Right? What was right about it, what was wrong about it. And that will also then count for an American government course, because many states require that you have an American government course. And likewise, for states that require a U.S. history course, a modern history will account for that. We'll have enough U.S. history in it to make it count. All right. Then natural science. And I'll get more into this when I go into the sequence, but we'll do biology, then physical science, essentially chemistry. But I called it physical science here to evoke Aristotle's physics. And then psychology. Psychology is something almost never touched on in Catholic programs nowadays, but historically, Catholic psychology was extremely important to the curriculum. And so that's included there. And then economics. And included within economics will be basic life skills like budgeting and doing your taxes and stuff. So that's just basic life skills needed. It's ridiculous that stuff's not taught in schools. Economics means household management. And so economics here will be at the service of actually managing your household. But also touching on macroeconomics, the king managing the household of the country. All right. Then we will have language arts. Language arts is essentially going to cover everything in the trivium and quadrivium I couldn't fit in anywhere else. So we'll have logic. I'd like to do 2 years of logic. I don't know where to fit that second year in, though. Then rhetoric. Then music didn't fit neatly into the mathematics program, even if as part of the quadrivium, it's part of mathematics. So I just included it in the language arts track here because I know where else to put it. I don't entirely like where it is here, but I haven't thought of a better spot to include it yet. Maybe if I can find a way to integrate the study of music into these actual mathematics classes, I will do that. And then probably rhetoric would get pushed up a year and we had a second year of logic here. But we'll have to see if I can figure out a way to make that work. Then last year we would do apologetics, so integrating logic and rhetoric, and then also a senior thesis project. This is just simply a lot of fun for students, and it makes them think back on all these different courses they've taken and do any sort of project related to any of the courses. And they'll have so many courses that will have interconnected. They'll be able, even if they want to do something, say maybe related to the New Testament, they might say, oh, well, I remember reading in ancient history about the Enuma Elish and the creation myth there. And here's how we see the world being created from these chaotic waters. And then we see Jesus walking on the waters, countering this ancient Babylonian creation myth, right? So they'll have lots of different areas from which they can draw on, no matter which area they want to look at. A dialectical method, yeah, that would probably be within logic. But ideally, if we had a second year of logic, we'd go into more stuff like that, like dialectics and stuff. But that will currently be within logic. And also in classical philosophy, we're going to be reading lots of Plato. So they'll get lots of dialectics through Plato. All right, there's pretty much no subject anywhere here that doesn't have a significant amount jumping in from another class. All right, oh, I realized I skipped mathematics here. So this is just the likely sequence, assuming they start algebra in like 8th grade. But if they started algebra in 7th grade, you would push it one back and there'd be an additional course. Or if they start algebra in high school, they can just work from there and just get through these first 3 then. All right, so we would start off with algebra, then get into the Euclidean geometry, so reading Euclid's Elements, then analytic geometry, which would really be the equivalent of something like Algebra 2, where they're going to be taking that geometry and applying it to a coordinate grid, and then using algebra to analyze it. Then astronomy, we're going to be studying the history of astronomy, starting with Ptolemy, then Kepler, and then Newton. So with Ptolemy, they will get trigonometry. Then with Kepler, they will look at ellipses. And then finally with Newton, we will introduce the basic elements of calculus, but Newton introduced those elements geometrically, showing geometrical proofs for his calculus. And since most students would not be prepared to analyze that, but since in mathematics they've actually done Euclidean geometry, this will actually be an intuitive way to introduce the ideas of calculus. Then they'll do actual calculus. And then after that, if they were advanced enough, they could do a class on essentially the advanced mathematics, the foundations of it, looking at things like set theory and so on like that. All right. And then finally, we have a Latin program here. So assuming they come in with enough knowledge to be able to read the Vulgate, we're first going to go through the Vulgate, matching up with our study of ancient history. Then classical Latin. So probably, I don't like reading Caesar. I think Caesar's kind of boring. So probably reading Cicero and Virgil in classical Latin. Then ecclesiastical Latin, reading people like St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure and St. Augustine. I think it's kind of ridiculous that so many Catholic school Latin programs don't touch on any medieval Latin. And then finally, in the last year, Latin prose composition. Actually integrating the study of grammar and really going back into Latin grammar to work on writing Latin. And then if they haven't had any Latin, we'll probably spend 2 years introducing Latin grammar and then do the first 2 courses, so the Vulgate and classical Latin there. All right. How will this curriculum be related to at least a reductio to theology? Yeah, that's a good question. Right, so it's not as though, here we go. And how will all the subjects be related more directly to theology integrally construed? Yeah, right, so our history and literature courses are setting the historical background to understanding theology. Our mathematics and language arts courses are, are going to be related to giving them the skills, the trivium and the quadrivium, to analyze other subjects. The natural science courses will have a lot of philosophy integrated so that they can understand the created world through a proper lens. And then in our psychology course is especially going to be important to discussing moral theology. Moral theology will be included within the discussion of psychology. And then Latin is going to give them the ability, if they want to get more advanced studies, to actually read the original sources involved. And that's a big thing with Latin. I don't want Latin to become just the chanting of declensions. I think that's really important to do, that you have all your declensions memorized, but that they actually come out being able to read Latin. So for those who are just coming in now, who don't have any background, I see the numbers going up quite a bit. This is a homeschool program for high schoolers, an online program that I'm working on constructing. I don't know how long this will take. It might take many years to construct this, but I wanted to announce it and get some ideas from other people. What do they think about it? If you're interested in some of the work it looks like I'm doing here, please reach out to me. I'd love some help with some of this. And so, yeah, this is just a project I'm working on. I wanted to share with some people so that I could see what people's responses to it would be. And if you have kids, please let me know either in the comments or through DMs or in the chat right now. Is this something you would be interested in having your kids enrolled in? Or if you already have kids who already went through high school, is this a program that you would have liked at the time? And probably also the way these courses would work would be pre-recorded video lectures, because there's no way we could possibly get this at a reasonable price. And I want it to be at a reasonable price. Some of these programs make parents like pay out of the pocket. Just like a lot of these parents don't have much money. They have many kids. These programs should not be expensive. And that's a big thing I want to work on here, is that I want this program to be reasonably priced. And so, yeah, it'll be pre-recorded video lectures, and then you'd be able to send me questions. You'd be able to pay for private tutoring. Hopefully, you'd have some other people on staff as well to help with that. And I would also then grade papers and tests and so on. Yeah, Bonaventure, absolutely reach out to me to discuss Shakespeare. I think that would be great. Yeah, I actually hated Shakespeare when I was in high school, and it wasn't until this year, actually, that I liked Shakespeare. Because I hated Shakespeare. Like, this doesn't make any sense. Then I went and I studied medieval philosophy and ancient philosophy in college. And then I had to teach Shakespeare this year as a middle school teacher. And I'm like, oh, actually, Shakespeare makes a lot of sense. You just have to know what in the world he's talking about, right? So, for example, in Merchant of Venice, there's the poem where in Act 5, where Jessica is very concerned and Lorenzo tries to calm her down by talking about the music of the heavenly spheres, and then relating that to Greek mythology, where Orpheus calms the wild beast through his lyre. Now, this poem makes absolutely no sense unless you understand ancient and medieval cosmology. But in this program, our students will have studied ancient and medieval cosmology. So this won't be coming in out of nowhere then. All right. Yeah, so let's get into what that's the basic overview of the whole program. But I want to get in and dive actually into discussing of history. A discussion of rather what the actual courses are going to be like. All right. Really hate how I really hate, for example, how Romeo and Juliet is the one play everyone is taught. It makes no sense to me. Only high schoolers are graduating who have never read Hamlet or any of his histories. I never read Hamlet or any of the histories. I still haven't. Some students at my high school did Julius Caesar, but my class did King Lear instead that year. The only one I actually liked in high school was Midsummer Night's Dream, just because that one actually is genuinely hilarious. And even that one, I hated reading it. It wasn't until I saw some performances of it that I actually started to love Midsummer Night's Dream. And if you want to introduce Shakespeare to younger kids, I think Midsummer Night's Dream is really probably the best one to do. It's such a great play. All right, so now we're going to get into history. All right, so SBA's history program covers the entirety of human history. It places a strong emphasis on divine providence in the Christocentric nature of history. These courses help provide historical context for the rest of the courses. So I've been developing this history program through my studies of divine providence in Scripture and how the sacred Scriptures understand human history. Because that is the wellspring for understanding history, is how the prophets interpret history. Right, and the Hebrews, they got the advantage that God literally sent them messengers to explain that history to them. But God has simply given us the tool of how history back then was interpreted and expects us now to be able to understand history in that light. So that's essentially what we're going to be doing here. All right, so ancient history. This course will cover the ancient Near East. This will help provide students with a stronger background in the historical context of the New Testament. We will cover the problems with archaeology and reconstructing history from this time period. So we're going to get the cultural context of the Bible, and then we're also just going to show how, right, a lot of the chronologies of this time and other things are on very shaky ground. So we're going to look at different possible chronologies of this period, what we can actually know from archaeology, and I think hopefully see that the Old Testament is our spine for interpreting the ancient Near East, because the Hebrews were the only culture who kept a good historical record of the timeline of their culture. And so we really have to interpret the rest of the evidence in that light. All right, so classical history. This course will cover the history of the Greeks and Romans. We will read the ancient historians themselves to see how they understood history. This will allow us to compare their theory of history with the Christian view of history seen in the Bible as studied in theology. Christian view of history seen in the Bible as studied in theology. Eusebius studied in this course, and Augustine studied simultaneously in literature this year, right? So when we read the Greeks and the Romans, we're actually going to be reading the original sources like Herodotus and Thucydides and Plutarch and other people, so that at the end of the year we can get the history of the early church by reading Eusebius. And meanwhile, in literature this year, we're going to end the year by reading City of God. And so now we really have three Christian views of divine providence, right? We have the one we learned in our theology classes by studying the Bible. We have it as understood by Eusebius and as it is understood by Augustine. And we also have different pagan views of divine providence, as seen especially contrasting Herodotus and Thucydides. And so we're going to discuss in this course, right, how we should interpret history, right? How was the Christian view different from the pagan view of history? And Thucydides really has a sort of proto-modern theory of history where there's no miracles or divine intervention at all, right? While Herodotus has a view that there seems to be a war between good and evil, but it's, first of all, a very Greek nationalist one. But secondly, it's a very pagan view of it. So we're going to contrast that with the scriptures, right? Which one is better from a Christian point of view, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of each? And then medieval history. This course will study the age of Christendom. We look at how Christianity was infused into the culture and politics of the time. So we're probably going to have a textbook to cover it as a whole. I've been looking at Timothy Flanger's book, The City of God versus the City of Man. I think is a great textbook for medieval and modern history. But I'd like to introduce some primary sources as well. I think especially Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks shows how the medievals understood divine providence and history. And we'll see just how biblical Gregory of Tours' view is and how influential it was at the time. And then modern history. This course will cover the recent centuries. I have no clue where the break between medieval and modern history should count as. somewhere between the Renaissance and the 1700s. We'll have to probably I'll design the two courses together as one long course and figure out where the natural breaking point of a year is. But somewhere in the middle between the Renaissance and the 1700s, we're going to be making the cutting line. We'll look at how we went from a Christian society to a secular one. And we'll also look at divine providence in this time period to see how God has not abandoned us and we should not lose hope. Right? Because we don't want the course to simply be, oh, the modern world is great. But we also don't want it to be, God has abandoned us, there's no more divine providence. And I think especially looking at the role of Marian apparitions within history will help this. I see my Wi-Fi is unstable on my side. Can people hear me okay? Let me know in the chats if you can hear me okay. Why couldn't adults also participate in the program? Oh, adults absolutely could. My goal is to get this out for homeschoolers, but no, absolutely. If an adult wanted to enroll in some of these classes, they could. And they could also probably proceed through these sequences a lot faster than a high schooler could. Right. I'm thinking the way it's going to work is there'll be some base amount to buy the course, and that will give you access to all the video lectures involved in it. And then another amount to enroll a student. And enrolling a student, what that will do essentially is provide support on our end, that they will get graded tests and papers, they'll be able to ask questions and so on and so forth. And that will be per student. So if they have a big family, they'll pay one base amount for the courses each time their student is enrolled, and they won't have to pay that base amount for future students on their family, but they will have to pay for the additional work on our end. That's the theory of how I have this working. And once they also have it, I want to give them lifetime access to these courses so that maybe they're in college and they say they're being taught stuff that contradicted what they were learning in this program, the more Catholic view. And so they can go back and restudy the material and understand what they're being taught now and what they were being taught back then and try and figure out which is true. All right. And remember, some of this stuff we want to teach is dogmatic, that the Catholic Church teaches this, so we should believe it with divine faith. Some of it is secondary, right? So we're teaching history. That there is divine providence in history. That's an object of faith. But how we understand how that works out in the nuances is very debatable, you know? And so we have to make that important distinction. Then there's also things that are known by natural reason that are true. And we want them to be able to think through those topics using logic and critical thinking skills. And so it's important that we have all of this integrated. And we help them understand what fits into what category there. All right. Then literature. So SBA's literature program pairs with the history program. We read great books from some of the earliest ever written to recent Christian literature. Every single book in the program has been intentionally selected for its literary qualities and themes. So I've tried to avoid picking books that are not Christian and are not of high literary quality. Right. Yeah, a lot of modern programs that, we just really want to encourage kids to read and then just throw anything at them. You know, I have a friend who I tutor his son. His son's in 4th grade at a Catholic school, in a supposedly classical Catholic school, and he had to read Diary of a Wimpy Kid. All right, maybe that's fine entertainment, but why is that part of a school-related reading program, right? The purpose of studying literature is so we can understand its themes and so we can learn from its literary quality to write great works of our own. The purpose of studying literature is to study literature. It's not to read for entertainment value. And that's very important. And something you'll notice in this program, I don't have cutesy games you play to teach this stuff. I don't have, here's how we're going to make it really fun for the student. No, learning should not be fun. Now, if you want to have, I think review games are a great way to review and help people remember stuff and get them excited. I don't think it's bad to get students excited to learn. But I don't think the primary method of teaching should be through making learning fun. The way you teach students is you teach them stuff genuinely worth learning. That's difficult to learn. and students will become happy that they have actually learned something, right? This is the whole thing of point of virtue ethics, right? Virtue ethics is not that we just simply do things to have joy because that's all right. No, it's to become happy through the development of virtue. So the way we become happy intellectually is through the acquirement of intellectual virtue. So absolutely, this program will be difficult for students. I'm not trying to design a program that they won't have to work hard. Now, they'll have to work hard, but they will genuinely benefit from that hard work. Right? And I think if you have smart students, because I did very well in high school, but I never had to do any work because I was never challenged by anything in high school. And so I developed a terrible study habit that I still, for the most part, have to this day, that I tried to shake off in college, but still haunted me really badly all the way through college, and still haunts me to this day. And so, yeah, I think it's very important that if a student is intelligent, we push that student, we give them hard work so that they develop good study habits. Right? If a student is smart, they absolutely will slack off if you're not pushing them. And since this is also a homeschool program, you can tailor it to the student, right? So if the student's having trouble, all right, we can go through and figure out which books in the literature program we're going to remove to give them more time with those books, or maybe abridge ignore unimportant chapters or stuff, right? We can tailor it to it. If they're doing really well and blowing through these courses, well, then we can give them more advanced material to go into, right? We want to match the student at the level they're at. That's something I want to work on as well for this. How can someone access this program? So this is something I'm just working on right now. It'll probably be a few years till this program starts coming out. If things work out perfectly, I'd love for this to be out in like 2 or 3 years, but that might not happen. Entirely depends, first of all, on just my employment situation and stuff, and also the time I have to work on this, how long it actually takes to get this done. So right now, it's just a hobby that I'm sketching out right now. And I did this podcast, not because this is going to be out soon, but because I wanted feedback from people. And also to let people who might be interested in helping with this to know. And so if you're interested in helping with this, absolutely please reach out to me. All right, so now in literature, let's look through these literature courses. All right, so ancient wisdom and epic. This course will compare the wisdom of the pagans with the wisdom of scripture. We will start off by reading the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh and compare the pagan understanding of Genesis with the biblical one. The Epic of Gilgamesh I just picked because it's the most complete ancient epic. The Enuma Elish is fragmentary, but I think it's really as good for the context. I considered switching out the Enuma Elish for those who don't know, this is the Babylonian creation myth. I considered switching it out for Hesiod's Theogony, which is the Greek creation myth, simply because the Theogony is more complete. We have the entire work versus the Enuma Elish is fragmentary. And so, yeah, that very well may happen. I just picked the Enuma Elish because we're going to be studying the Egyptians and the Babylonians at this time. And so I thought it might be useful to have that cultural context. But it very well might be the Theogony when this program's actually out. We will then read the wisdom literature to understand God's wisdom for us in contrast to the pagans, right? So we're going to read through Proverbs, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, and Job and understand God's wisdom and compare it to this pagan wisdom that we have. Right. So the classical or the Old Testament program is going to cover the historical books and the prophets, whereas the wisdom books are going to be covered in our literature courses. In wisdom and Sirach, we're going to cover in the next year of literature because those are written during the classical period. We're only going to be reading the ones that were written originally in Hebrew. Actually, I think Sirach we've now found was originally written in Hebrew, but it was still written during the Hellenistic period, not during this ancient period. All right. In the second semester, we will begin our study of the classical world by looking at the Bronze Age Greece through the Iliad, right? So we're going to use the Iliad to get a look into what Bronze Age Greece was like as Greece was forming. I'd love to read the Odyssey as well, there's simply not enough time in this program to read the Iliad and the Odyssey. I'd rather prioritize other works than the Odyssey. And the reason I picked the Iliad rather than the Odyssey is, first of all, I think it's better for historical context. It's more based in reality. The second reason is that I just prefer the Iliad to the Odyssey. And so that's why we're going to choose the Iliad. I think the Iliad, the Trojans, are some good heroes within it. And I think the Odyssey doesn't really have any heroes. So, also, our study of the Iliad and the Odyssey will not be how great the Iliad is and how wonderful the virtues are taught in Homer. No, I think that's ridiculous. Homer's morality is abhorrent at most parts. And so we're going to be looking at, for the most part, actually how abhorrent the morality taught in the Iliad is, and show just how superior the morality taught in the Bible is. That's going to get me some hot takes. But I will say, almost all the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey are in hell, according to Dante. So take it up with Dante. All right, we will then use the Greeks to look at the Persians through Xenophon's Cyropaedia. This is a great literary work of the actual classical world. What was I going to say? Yeah, it's a study of Cyrus, who's this great hero in the Bible, right? We hear that Cyrus is this great hero, and then we get almost nothing about him. So we're going to get to really research about the life of Cyrus through this work. It's also just a great literary work. It shows us also what the Greeks thought about the Persians. And its historical accuracy has been attacked a lot by modern historians, but I actually think it's more historically accurate than Herodotus. And when we read Herodotus the next year in history, we are going to compare Xenophon and Herodotus and try and look into which one is more historically accurate. And then additionally, students will read and study one psalm each day, right? So at the beginning of each day of literature class, like we'll get a poem, and the poem will be one psalm. So we'll get a psalm throughout the year. And even though the book of Psalms, much of it was written in the lifetime of King David, I think it was actually compiled as a whole, as we have it now, during the post-exilic period, probably by someone like Ezra or someone working at the temple. So at the end of the year, we will bring all the study of the Psalms back together and study the book as a whole, right? So this whole year we've been studying each psalm on its own, its literary value and its theological meaning. And I'll probably actually have them each day encourage families too, right? The student will study the psalm in the morning in their class, and then at evening prayer, the family should pray the psalm. Right now that they understand the theological meaning, maybe part of that assignment should be that the student has to explain to their family before evening prayer the meaning of it, so that they can actually pray the psalm as a family together at the evening prayer and really understand what they're praying. And then at the end of the year, we're going to bring this whole study of each of the psalms together and study the literary structure of the book as a whole. Because even though these were each written individually, they were then compiled into a singular book that has a literary structure to it. All right. Yeah, the classes would be pre-recorded. I love live classes. There's no way in the world we'll ever get the resources to put out live classes of these. Other languages besides Latin, I do want to eventually add Greek and Hebrew into the curriculum, but I don't know about modern languages. There's honestly so many good programs out there for studying modern languages now. If you want your student to learn a modern language, just also enroll them in one of those programs. The stuff I want here is to be stuff you can't get elsewhere, and that's a big thing. We are going to study both classical and ecclesiastical Latin. And yeah, the study of memory will be included within the study of psychology, which we're going to get to later in this. I think Babylonian texts would be good because you can compare the fragmentary nature of most ancient Near Eastern texts to the completeness of the scriptures. Yeah, that's a very good point that we can see, right? Why are historians prioritizing archaeology that can be interpreted so many different ways in fragmentary texts and saying that's more authoritative than the Bible, where we have a detailed account of all of history that's complete? You know, this doesn't make any sense at all why this is the basis for our study. And yeah, that might be a very good reason to include the Enuma Elish. I also think another reason to include it over the Theogony is that most students who've been involved in classical programs probably already have a pretty good background in Greek mythology, so it'll be something different before that. All right, then classical philosophy. This will match with our classical history course. All right. So this course will study philosophy to introduce topics that will be taken up in numerous other classes. It's really going to introduce a lot of important themes for other stuff. We will begin by studying Plato to introduce the ideas of metaphysics, justice, divine love, the harmony of the heavenly spheres, and many other important themes. The reason I haven't listed which Platonic dialogues we'll read is I'm still trying to figure that out. That would be, I mean, ideally, I'd like to work through, like, I try to come up with lists, and by the end of the time, these lists that are so long, it would take multiple years to study these. I've also tutored a 9th grader in the Gorgias, and so I know how long it can take for students to properly understand a Platonic dialogue, so I don't want to overburden students. You know, I'd rather we don't get to as much in Plato, but the students really understand it. See, that part is still very much in development, but definitely going to read Plato. The reason I chose Plato over Aristotle is that Plato's works are also of great literary value. And this is a philosophy, this is a literature course, not just a pure philosophy course. All right. And computing this all, when we get into the Latin course, I'll explain the logic behind my series of Latin classes. You should study Indian philosophy and religion and have a critique and response, because many fall away from classical religion into a new age Eastern neo-paganism universalism. Don't ignore the Vedic East, because then students will not be armed to deal with it. Yeah, that's a fair point. I thought a little bit about including actually some Chinese literature, because I find that interesting, but there's genuinely no way to fit that into the timeline. But maybe I could try and fit into some of it into this ancient course. If I can find any way to fit anything like Vedic or Chinese into these classes, I will. I just don't know where to include them. This is designed for an American audience, you can tell with the civics course. So some of it would have to be adapted to foreign classes, right? So if it was to be studied in the East, there probably should be, and I don't know where you'd fit it in here, an additional course in history on Asian history, an additional course in somewhere in literature on Indian and Chinese philosophy. But yeah, that is a fair point that maybe I should include it somewhere in here to respond to it as well. That's a good thing to think about. Yeah, someone asked about other works of Bonaventure. You know, other works of Aristotle, rather. Other works of Aristotle will appear in other courses. It's just not in this classical philosophy course. All right. We will then study Sirach and Wisdom to look at the reception of Greek philosophy among the Jews, right? So when these two books of the Bible were written, the Jews knew about Plato at this point, and they knew about Aristotle. And so how do they take it in, or how do they disagree with it? And so that's why I put these two courses here as well. All right. On the second semester, so the history course will be 1 semester of Greek history and 1 semester of Roman history. So philosophy will be 1 semester of Greek philosophy and 1 semester of Roman philosophy. On the second semester, we'll shift to Roman literature. We will first read the Aeneid to look at divine providence and piety in Roman paganism. We will then compare this with Augustine by reading the Confessions and City of God. All right, so we have now first read the Aeneid to really understand Roman culture and divine providence also, because that's been a big theme in these classes. Then we'll read Augustine, so the Confessions, to understand the influence of Plato upon Augustine and who he is. And then we're going to read City of God, which will refute paganism. And then we'll review all of I'm going to say that will be a good background for it'll be a good review, rather, of biblical history by reading the second half of City of God. All right, then we're going to shift over in our third year to Dante and Shakespeare. So this course will look at the great Christian writers of the Middle Ages and early modern period. The first semester will read the entirety of the Divine Comedy. I could read other stuff. This is really the greatest work of medieval literature, and it has such great theological value. So I really want to go in depth on it. So I think it's good to spend a whole semester on it. And then the second semester, we will read and watch a number of Shakespeare plays. This will get into Shakespeare then and look at Christian themes within him. And I haven't picked out a list of what Shakespeare plays that would be yet. So that's why there's no list of them there. All right. The fourth year of literature would be the crisis of modernity. This course will look at the problem of living as a Christian in the modern world. The first semester we'll read Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov and Lewis's The Great Divorce. So initially, this course is just going to be the whole Brothers Karamazov for half a year. This is such a great work of living as a Christian in a world moving towards secularism. But I decided to also include C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, because I think this is a book that just really helps people a lot wrestle with the question of how could a loving God send someone to hell? And it fits in nicely here as well. And it's not that long, so it could easily be thrown in at the end of the semester, right? So this first semester is more, how can you live as an individual in a secular world, right? Brothers Karamazov, we're still in a Christian world, but it's secularizing. And The Great Divorce, we're now looking at, right, this big objection to Christianity and how it can be dealt with in a secular world. All right. So in the second semester, we're going to look at living in a society as a Christian. So the second semester, we will look at the end of secularism, right? So the teleological end of it, by reading Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World. What is it? So, right, we have these two sort of end goals, either a complete totalitarian society by top-down government in 1984, and Huxley in Brave New World, which I actually think is a lot more accurate, but 1984 is so culturally relevant, I thought it should probably be included. Where Huxley, right, where they are controlling people by trying to give them so much pleasure, they're not going to question the world around them, and they're going to be controlled, right? But we don't want to leave students with just this horrible dystopian vision. So we will then compare this with the Christian vision of the future in Lewis's Space Trilogy, where C.S. Lewis lays out this great cosmic vision. He's also trying to reconcile how do we deal with the relationship between classical cosmology, which is so connected to classical philosophy, and the modern view of the cosmos. This is a great series for trying to deal with some of these issues. I think these issues genuinely haven't been resolved, so I don't want to present them to a student like they've been resolved. I want to present them in this, here's how C.S. Lewis is dealing with this problem, and let's try and understand how he is. You can make an argument for Fahrenheit 451 versus 1984. I just included 1984 because of the cultural relevance. I actually kind of hate how oversighted it is, and I almost didn't include it because of that. But I think it's a good contrast to Huxley's view, because I think Huxley has a much more Christian vision of dystopia, that we can be controlled through pleasure. Right? I think also seeing partly maybe how Orwell's vision, I think, is a little bit insufficient as a result. And we can see that through their views, right? So Orwell was a socialist. So his whole thing is to be about government controlling, and we need to be liberated and be free. Whereas Huxley was a perennialist. And so Huxley, even though his philosophy is wrong, he's a perennialist, he is very well versed in classical philosophy. And so he's going to get a lot more of this right as a result. Yeah, Orwell may be cut from the course, but I think it's a good vision of actually reading Orwell to understand how he's wrong. All right, so now we're going to get into the theology course here. All right, so SBA's theology program provides a comprehensive overview of Catholic teaching. The first 2 years are an in-depth study of sacred scripture. The third year then brings this study to provide a systematic account of Catholic theology. The fourth year then looks out at the world and addresses it from a Catholic perspective. Right, so first we want to analyze the content of divine revelation. And then we want to analyze, okay, what is actually the teaching of the church based on all of this then, right? And show how our dogmatic theology arises from sacred scripture naturally as a natural development from it. And then we want to look out at the world and what does Catholic teaching have to say about our response to the rest of the world? All right, so Old Testament. Our Old Testament and New Testament courses will not be survey courses in the Old and New Testament. They absolutely will not be survey courses. Students coming in will be already expected to know the major narratives, including the ones that are less popularly known. So students should already know who all the major prophets are. They should already know the major kings of Israel. I think it's Memoria Press that actually has a very detailed program just going into the literal sense of scripture for elementary and middle school students. So I highly recommend students should have gone through a program like that before enrolling here, because we will not stop to explain the literal sense of these major narratives in the scripture. So students should already be very well versed in it. Right? We might design actually a basic biblical literacy course for students to take so that they have enough background to get into this year. Yeah, so if a parent wanted to enroll and they hadn't have it, I'd highly recommend doing a summer class on the narrative of scripture before they would dig into something like this. And ideally, they should really have multiple years of biblical literacy before they dive in here. So I know with Memoria Press's program, for example, they spend 4 years on biblical literacy in 3rd through 6th grade. And you really should have something like that before diving into a program like this. All right, so the Old Testament. This course will closely analyze the Old Testament. We'll look at the 4 senses of Scripture through a close literary analysis of the text. This course will cover the entire Old Testament, minus books covered in other courses. So the wisdom literature and the Psalms will be covered in literature, and the Maccabees I'm going to include in the New Testament course as a historical background to the New Testament. But the rest of everything will just be in our Old Testament course. And really diving in deeply. If you want to get a background to how I would teach it, I highly recommend either taking a look at my scripture class stuff I've done on my channel, or listening to or reading James Jordan and Peter Lightheart, because I'm very influenced by their style of biblical exegesis. Also, Alistair Roberts has done a good biblical commentary that's on YouTube. That's a similar style, where you look at the 4 senses of Scripture, but rather than treating them as 4 arbitrary senses that we're laying on top of the text, I want to show how the other senses naturally arise from the literary context of it. I also think this will really help students better understand other literature. It wasn't where I hated English class growing up. It wasn't until I studied scripture that I actually understood how symbolism functions. And I actually remember my senior year of high school is when I became a Christian, and I started studying James Jordan a ton over high school in my senior year. And I noticed by the end of the year, I was actually enjoying English class, and that was never a class in my life I had enjoyed before. But by the end of the year, I now understood how symbolism worked enough to actually enjoy English class. And so, yeah, I think that's very important to understand that. And also the Bible, right, it gives us the eyes to see the rest of the world. And so that's so important. And then New Testament, this course will pick up where the last one left off. We'll start by reading the 2 books of Maccabees and Josephus to get a cultural context for the New Testament. And that'll be about 2 or 3 weeks of just cultural context. So we pick up the history and speed forward to what's going on now. And the first semester will be dedicated to the Gospels, and the second to the Epistles and Revelations. We get an in-depth study of the New Testament. All right, then dogmatic theology. This course will be a study in the essential dogmatic teachings of the Catholic Church. St. Bonaventure's Breviloquium will form the backbone of this study. This is going to be our textbook. But many other works by saints and doctors will be brought in to go in-depth on particular topics, especially on Bonaventure's treatment of God and the Trinity in the Breviloquium. He just basically restates the dogmatic teachings of the church, but he really doesn't go into the inner logic of why we believe those things. And I think I might use St. Anselm's Monologion to explain a lot of that, but reading Anselm through a very Scotist and Bonaventurian lens, because St. Anselm was highly influential on Bonaventure and Scotus, so we'll be using their interpretations of Anselm if we read Anselm for this course. I'm also thinking of probably including Athanasius's On the Incarnation to help round out our study of the Atonement, and maybe some other stuff here and there as well. All right, and then finally, civics. So this course will be a study in the social teaching of the Catholic Church. And remember, at this point in the science courses, they will have taken psychology. So they'll already know what the intellect and the will is. They'll know teleology. They actually will have learned teleology in their Latin class. So they'll understand when we talk about natural ends of creatures. In biology, we also will have talked about how teleology is integral in biology. Right? So this is, even though it's listed under the theology section, everything else we've been doing in all our other classes is going to play a role here. So the first semester will be a study in Catholic social teaching. The second semester, we will apply this to a study of the American founding. We will read the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers to discuss where the founders followed natural law and where they departed from it. These are so important to read as Americans, right? All these modern American government courses, they don't teach you about the American founding. They don't teach you what the founders were actually writing. And I think that that's so more important, that they will actually have a cultural literacy of where this stuff came from. And this also serves as a credit in American government, because that's required in most states. And it's also just a good background to have as well. But we're not going to be studying American government just as some arbitrary thing, but how it relates to Catholic social teaching. I'm going to take a quick second to catch my breath here before I go on to the next section. We've been going on for about an hour and 15 minutes here. I didn't realize it would be so long. All right, yeah, I'll go into the chat. Kind of a shot, but interestingly, any classes on manners and etiquette, like those old manuals on how to be Christian gentlemen. I don't think you can do that in an online program, right? The advantage they had teaching that in old schools was you were actually physically there and could analyze stuff. I think that just has to be taught by parents now, right? Parents have to instill good etiquette in their children. Because it's only someone who's physically there can really work on that with someone. All right. There we go. Caught my breath a little bit now. All right, natural science. You notice I'm calling it here natural science, right? Science is a body of knowledge, right? We studied here theological science, right? Literature and history usually weren't counted as sciences, but humanities, right? But we're just going to study below mathematical science. We're going to be studying rational science, right? In language. So this is natural science. It's just the study of the natural world. And I think that's important to help people understand. This is not a tool to understand the entirety of everything. This is a tool to study the natural world. And so SBA's natural science program integrates traditional Catholic philosophy with modern science. SBA is the only homeschool program that teaches science on its proper philosophical foundations. The philosophy in these courses will be utilized in other courses, right? So we're also going to be teaching philosophy along with it to properly understand the science that we're learning. In a lot of schools, they do teach both the philosophy and the science, but they don't integrate the two. And it's important, right? So, however, philosophy is not taught as arbitrary propositions as it is in most philosophy courses, but as real principles of nature in accord with sound science. Right? So it's not, though, a lot of those, I think, have a very bifurcated view of the study of nature. You go to a science course and learn what modern science is. You go to a philosophy course and learn what Aristotle said, and there's no connection between the two. Or if there is a connection, that's up to you to figure out on your own. And oftentimes then, the science teachers sort of look down their nose at the philosophy teachers teaching bad science, and the philosophy teachers look down their nose at the science teachers teaching bad philosophy. We need to integrate them as a singular study of the natural world, so that these philosophical propositions are actually ones that arise from the natural world. I think that's so important. And so my science sequence here is based off the way Aristotle's sequence was traditionally taught. All right, so The study of natural philosophy traditionally began with Aristotle's History of Animals, right, and related books as well, The Parts of Animals, Theophrastus's History of Plants. And this wasn't what's the philosophy behind animals? It was, what was it was how do I explain? It was basically, right, we observe animals out in the world and try and explain that. Not getting too in deep with the philosophy here, but trying to get at that. All right, so it's a good way to start off, right? We're observing things that we can directly see and beginning to try and understand those. So when we get to more abstract stuff like our minds or the universe or things like that, we'll have a good grounding in things that are more immediate to our senses and how we go about this technique. All right, so this biology course will analyze animals and all organisms in general, the way God intended them to be studied as living organisms in environments. Parts are ordered to wholes so that when we consider the parts of organisms, we consider them as parts of wholes rather than as standalone. We will also consider the claims of evolution and whether it is sound science. Right, so but we're going to be looking at what was I going to say? We're looking at how these are parts ordered to wholes, right? So the way a lot of modern biology courses work is they take an animal and they dissect it and break it down, and they'll say, all right, this works this way, this part works that way, right? But they're really just considering these as parts on their own. And the parts are based off of smaller chemical processes. And then the chemicals are based off of smaller processes of atoms, right? And these ultimately then, these animals and plants and all these biological organisms are considered as, just, losing my train of thought here. Right? They're considered really just as amalgamations of smaller things, rather than Aristotle's way, where he first looked at the whole of the animal and then understood why the parts exist. They exist as parts ordered to wholes. Right? Some people do want to just teach Aristotle's History of Animals, but the other issue with it is that we know some of this observation of animals in it are actually just incorrect now. And so we want sound, correct science, right? So we want to integrate the best study of modern science into it, right? A lot of study of Aristotle, unfortunately, became repeating statements from Aristotle rather than taking his method and actually investigating the natural world. And that's what we're going to be doing, not just taking facts from textbooks as though they're fact, but analyzing the natural world through the way Aristotle does. All right, and then we will also consider the claims of evolution and whether it is sound science. Right, so we want to be analyzing some creationist science, looking at things like paramenology and stuff, and how we can understand some of the evidence for evolution in a creationist way, and whether the evidence is actually evidence for evolution. If I extend this to a course in middle school as well, the 8th grade year would be geology, right? Giving us the background of some of this material. That then comes up in biology, but there's nowhere to fit that in high school, so I didn't include it then. All right. Now let's go into biology here, or rather physical science, right? So we studied biology. All right. So the in-depth study of natural philosophy was through Aristotle's physics. And so we take the approach Aristotle has in the physics, but integrate the best of modern science into it. So this course, we will first consider the proper philosophy of corporeal substances. We will look at matter, form, and the four causes. Right? So understanding a proper philosophy of the natural world. Once we have established the correct foundation, the course will proceed as an introductory study of chemistry. This avoids falling into the atomistic reductionism that is universal in modern culture. And we're not just going to reduce things down to atoms. We're going to understand atoms are real things. We're going to realize atoms aren't just matter, right? Atoms have some sort of form to them that makes them, right? That's what they are, right? So we have an element. That element has powers to it. It's not just matter. There's some sort of powers to it. And matter is just potency. There has to be some sort of formal causality. And likewise, we can't just consider efficient causality. We have to consider final causality within nature. Wolfgang Smith has done a lot of good work here, has have other people like Ed Fazer and Alexander Proust and others, but I want to take that academic literature and actually explain it in such a way it could be understood at an introductory level. I think that's so important there. This is, I think, one of the hardest courses to develop here, but I think once it's developed, it would be one of the most important classes they're going to take, understanding the natural world in an Aristotelian way. All right, so now psychology. One of the most difficult but most important topics in natural philosophy was the function of the mind, right? Before we can discuss moral theology or anything like that, we have to know how the mind works. So this course will consider psychology from both a material and spiritual standpoint. We will discuss how our mind works and how we can use this knowledge to live a good life. All right, so we want to understand how the mind works and how we can use it to live a virtuous life, right? So we're going to integrate some moral theology and probably some of the spiritual life as well into this, right? How can we take these principles and actually apply them? But it's going to be a science course as well, so we are going to look at it from a scientific perspective. There's been quite a number of people who've looked at modern psychology from a Thomistic perspective, but I also do know someone working on it from a Scotist perspective, and he's offered to help with some of this. If you want to hear my interview with him, it was on my patrons. If you subscribe to me on Patreon, you can get my interview with him on Scotism and psychology. And I think that's also important to integrate the modern psychology, because a lot of people, they're confused. We have the brain, we have the soul. It seems like the brain can explain everything. Why do we need the soul? And we're going to see through proper philosophy, no, we still need the soul, but it makes sense that we still have the brain there. So it's still important to study how the brain actually operates, right? Because the soul is the form, and so the soul animates the body. And so actually, we do have thoughts in our mind, right? In our brain. The chemicals in our brain are related to the thoughts in our mind, because the soul is the form of the body. I do want to make these courses, though, so they're not just Scotist philosophy. I'll probably phrase it in such a way it's more just based in Aristotle, especially for biology and physical science. Psychology will be more Scotist, because there is just significant disagreements between Thomas and Scotus Thomas, so I think Scotus is correct. But especially the first two, it's going to be a more general thing, so that I don't think a Thomist would really object to most of what we're discussing in those courses. And then the last thing, I put economics here because I think it's important to cover somewhere. But if you want to go to college for science, I probably recommend doing an additional science course here as well. Probably you can also, homeschoolers can most of the time enroll at local community colleges. So just start taking college level science at this point for additional credits. But all right, so we're going to have economics, though. I think that's important as to discuss, and it fit in nicely here, so I put it here. So this course will pair with civics. It's the same year we're discussing civics, to discuss how money and the economy work. Since the original meaning of economia was household management, we will discuss practical finance, such as how to budget and how to pay taxes. This will set students up well to live on their own after their graduation, right? So the first course will be like economics as a science, first semester, and second semester will be, all right, how do we apply those principles to our own life and just pay our taxes, budget, basic things like that that are really useful when students get out. Oh, typo here. There we go. All right. Now we're going to move on to mathematics. So I already discussed a whole bunch about the philosophy of mathematics at the beginning of this. So if you want more on this, go back to the beginning of the live stream. But here we go. So SBA's mathematics course treats mathematics not as a set of arbitrary tools to manipulate numbers, but as a logical system that helps students see God's beauty in creation. SBA teaches the whole of the quadrivium as well through mathematics. I guess music is currently not within this mathematics curriculum. It's covered in in our liberal arts track. Simply just, I can't figure out how to fit it into the mathematics course, but I'd like to put it in the mathematics. I sent this document around to a few people for the last few days to get their thoughts. And you'll notice the mathematics sequence that I have laid out here is not the one in the one I was sending around. Originally, I had an entire great books program for mathematics, but I decided, I think I have a lot of issues with purely great books programs because mathematics is not a great book subject. Mathematics is a logical system that we use to investigate nature, right? It's over half of the 7 liberal arts. Right? And so it's so important that I think we teach it as that logical system. But I still want to try and, as much as possible, bring in a classical approach that a great books program has so that they can understand the beauty, right? Mathematics is not just a system of manipulation. So I think when students are young, all that's important is math facts, right? There's no reason an elementary school student needs to be trying to get more advanced mathematics. Just teach them their multiplication, addition, division, subtraction, so on tables. If they memorize all those tables, then maybe and it's only once you have those tables, then introduce fractions to them. Do not introduce fractions before they first have all their different tables memorized, because then they're going to have to go to someone like me when I'm doing tutoring to try and help them with their fractions, and I'm going to discover they don't know anything. The reason that elementary school students study so much with fractions is that we try and teach them conceptually. And I've discovered when I just teach students, all right, here's the method you use to get the right answer for a fraction. It works really well. And then they develop the sense of what it actually means. It's when they're young, students do not have the sense to get these abstract principles. When they are young, you teach them a method to get the right answer. And then they learn why that was the correct answer when they get older. But once we're in a high school math setting, we're going into more the theory behind the math. And so it's really important that we understand the proofs behind the principles we're discussing. All right. So what was the classical approach to math? I probably should break that down. There was 4 liberal arts in math. There was arithmetic, the study of just pure numbers. Geometry, where we were, instead of looking at pure numbers, we were looking at numbers in space, right? So how one set of numbers relates to another set within space. We had music, which was the study of numbers over time and in harmony with one another. So really, it wasn't so much over time, but in harmony to one another. It was the big focus of classical music. And then astronomy, where we look at the heavens and we look at them, that geometry once it's in motion. And that's really great that we had all of that. The problem is some of that, it doesn't cover everything you need for a modern mathematics education. Now, I think it's important to understand the quadrivium because it's the basis of it. So I think we need to look at the different elements of modern mathematics and where do they fit into this classical mathematics approach. So algebra originally was actually a development of geometry. But I think it shouldn't, initially I was thinking, okay, it should be taught as geometry then. But the problem is you might get the theory of algebra with geometry, but you're not going to have enough practice just actually doing algebra. And it's so important that you can just have quick skills with algebra to be able to do algebra in your head very quickly. So I want to have it with numbers. So algebra, first course is Algebra 1. Hopefully students will have already done Algebra 1 before they step in. But this course would be fully available even if you weren't enrolled in everything else for middle school students to already start on algebra. Really by 8th grade, they should be in algebra. And ideally by 7th grade, they should be in algebra. If they're not in algebra by 7th grade, it's probably because you tried to teach them more advanced stuff when they were young instead of just focusing on their math facts. I'm going to get a lot of hate from someone on that, I feel like. All right. So let's look through this now. So Algebra 1. This course will use Euler's Elements of Algebra to study algebra. For those who don't know, Leonhard Euler was sort of one of the greatest early modern mathematicians. And he was actually a very devout Christian. Fortunately, he was Protestant. He was very, very devout in his Christianity, and actually took a lot of heat from when he worked in Germany. He took a lot of heat in the German court for just how devout he was, because the Enlightenment was in full swing at this point. But modern mathematicians have to cope with the fact that one of the greatest mathematicians ever to live, and really the founder of modern mathematics, was a fundamentalist Christian, like to the extreme. Now, unfortunately, Euler also spent a while in Russia, where he actually did not like the Russian Orthodox Church, because the church at the time, because of the Enlightenment, was reasonably skeptical of the academy. But unfortunately, that meant people like Euler were treated badly by the Orthodox Church. And so I think it's important that we treat the academy fairly. And so, yeah, Euler has a whole textbook on algebra where he logically starts off with just basic number theory and then builds up the whole of algebra through that. He actually interestingly introduces imaginary numbers super early on. He's just going through functions and he says, well, what if we took the square root of -1? Some of the notation in Euler is a little outdated, so we may put out a new version of the textbook. It's actually, there's a version of it in the public domain that's translated into English. So I may go back through it. There's actually a few little tiny mistakes in it, or things that were mathematics was not as well developed. So that should probably just be taken out and put in an appendix, not to confuse students. And also just update the notation. So put I in for square root of -1 and stuff like that. So we'll also use Euclid's Elements, especially books 2 and 7, and Cardano's Ars Magna to show geometric proofs for the claims of algebra. Right, so since a lot of this stuff arose from geometry, I think it is still useful to see those geometric proofs, because it really gives you a visual intuition of what's going on in algebra. Otherwise, algebra just becomes symbol manipulation according to rules, right? And the whole point of this is that we want it to help students see God's beauty in creation, and geometry really helps do that. So we can show them how this fits into nature, right? The mathematics we're doing the symbol manipulation is an abstraction that comes out of this beautiful geometry in nature. This will also lay the foundation for next year, right? So next year we're actually going to be just studying Euclid. So they will have seen some Euclid by actual practice now. We probably won't go into the details of his proofs, because one of the great things about Euclid is his proofs are visual. So we can visually show his proof, even if we're not laying out and going into detail on all the axioms. They'll understand how a Euclidean proof works visually. So next year, when we actually get into the real logical proofs, they'll have the background for that. All right. And since Euler omits graphing in his book, some graphing will be supplemented. It's probably good to have a really basic idea of how graphing works. But a fuller introduction to graphing will be given in analytic geometry, because I want to show how graphing, which is so central now to algebra, actually arose out of geometry. And so I really want to wait till we do Euclid to really dive into depth on graphing. But as a result, Euler goes a lot further than a normal introductory algebra course does, right? Most introductory algebra courses don't have imaginary numbers. They don't go into powers higher than the power of 2 and so on. Versus we're going to be going into stuff way more advanced in the manipulation of numbers, and then save all of the geometrical aspects of algebra for another year, because that's a separate course, really. All right, so then Euclidean geometry. So geometry was the basis of all higher mathematics traditionally. There was also a traditional textbook, Euclid's Elements. Now, the reason that Euclid was the basis is actually, ironically, the ancients, even though they said it should start with arithmetic, did not have a well-developed number theory, right? So Nicomachus was the standard for ancient arithmetic, but he actually just gets a lot of stuff wrong because he's guessing, versus if you actually dive into the number theory books of Euclid, he gets basically everything correct because he's working through it with logical proofs, while Nicomachus is guessing based on patterns he's seeing a lot of the time. So that's ancient arithmetic is really very outdated at this point. So the Elements was such a rigorous work until the 1800s. It was still being studied in schools. Right? Abraham Lincoln actually said that when he wanted to write a speech, he would first go to Euclid's Elements to understand how you prove something. And then he would write his speech. So he would think, when he said whenever he didn't know how to demonstrate something logically, reading Euclid helped him understand how something is demonstrated, right? Not just convinced, but actually demonstrated from first principles. All right. So cover the core books of Euclid's Elements. Probably just the first 6 books of Euclid's Elements. Probably not book 4, because that one's not important. Yeah, some of the number theory ones, right? We will have studied before. And the 3-dimensional ones, we might touch on a little bit, but I think I'd rather just focus. I'd rather spend more time on the important stuff than spend a bunch of time on the less important stuff and then just get confused. So this is the book all the saints learn geometry from. And it teaches geometry like no modern book does. This is, if the textbook that the saints used to learn geometry is still perfectly usable today and not outdated, why are we not using it? That's my argument. That's one of my main arguments for using Euclid's Elements. But it also teaches geometry like no modern books does. From just a compass and a straight edge, it proves almost every major proposition of geometry. This will allow students to learn how to prove something and give them a visual intuition for proofs, right? So if, what was it? If we want to see how to prove something, right? If students want to learn really how to be creative and prove something, right? Think about, you only have the tools of a compass and a straight edge. What can you prove? There was a great talk I listened to from a teacher who teaches Euclid's Elements in a high school. And he said initially, students just complained that the proofs in Euclid's Elements seemed completely unnecessary. So many things that were just obvious. Why do you need to prove that? So he said he now starts the course. He gives them a straight edge, not a ruler, but a straight edge, and a compass, and asks them to prove stuff with it. And they'll start to prove stuff with it, and they'll show their proof to him, and he'll point out issues in their proof. And they'll get really frustrated really quickly that they can't prove anything with it. And then when they actually see how Euclid does prove so much stuff in it, they'll be really impressed with it and actually have a genuine appreciation for Euclid's proofs. So I think it's just really good that they understand creativity, right? The rules of math didn't arise out of nowhere. They were creatively discovered to solve problems. And I think that's another advantage of teaching geometry here. And we have analytic geometry the next year. So we did Euclidean geometry, is not in a coordinate grid. And then we have analytic geometry. So this course will cover the union of algebra and geometry through the coordinate plane. It will roughly correspond to Algebra 2. So analytic geometry, this was brought in by Descartes to unite the two fields of algebra and geometry and basically invent modern mathematics. And so that's what this course will essentially be covering, is how those two were united and we came up with modern mathematics. All right. Will it be possible to integrate scholastic disputation at all? I don't know how to do that, simply because it's going to be online lecture courses. Now, I'd love if people could set up homeschool co-ops based off of this, where there could be enough students to discuss and dispute it. I'd love to help set those up, but that would be later on in the process. As it is, all of this is a giant task to get on, and I'm not going to consider anything besides basically what's on this syllabus until all of this is done. All right. This is brilliant, honestly. Thank you. Most graduates could just go into professional or professional track careers and not need additional liberal arts BA. That's exactly the point of this, right? That all of this stuff that we put into a liberal arts BA is comprehensible by high school students. And so we need to get this out there so they can actually read it as high school students. So yeah, that's why I want to put this out there, so students will actually learn it and stuff, right? Get this material out there. So there's a lot of this course. Why are our families going basically bankrupt and putting our students into debt they're never going to be able to repay in their life for degrees that aren't going to get them a job? Well, it's because that information is more valuable than a job. But the information you learn in a liberal arts degree is far more important than the actual job. But it's a huge amount of money you're going to spend there. So why can't we create a resource so they can get that education that they would have spent $200,000 on and let them get it for a few $100s online, right? That's really what I want this to be, is give them the materials that they can use it so they don't have to spend, parents don't have to go bankrupt, and the families don't have to spend all their money to do this. And the kids go into tons of debt. All right. Our next, in Benedictus Intellectus, is that who I think it is? Trying to figure out a way to ask if this is who I think it is without doxing you. Did we have a conversation on the phone about math education about a week ago? That's how I'll phrase it, so you know who I'm talking about without doxing you there. All right. Okay, yeah, it is who I think it is. All right. Now we're going to go into it. We've developed analytic geometry, and we've done music, hopefully, and language arts. So now we want to apply that study of geometry to studying the natural world in astronomy, the traditional background. Okay, it isn't the person who I thought it was. That's funny. Okay, that's funny. All right, yeah. Stephen, welcome anyways. Yeah, I was guessing you were someone else who we both also know, but... All right, going into astronomy then. So we want the background in astronomy then, right? Because that was one of them. But this is where it starts getting controversial, right? Because there's a lot of dispute within the traditional Catholic world between geocentrism, heliocentrism, so on and so forth. But this is not a course in the philosophy of astronomy, right? We're going to discuss some of Newton and Galileo's disputes in modern history and read some of their letters back and forth, hopefully. In literature, we're going to read, hopefully, some of Plato's Timaeus. We're going to see the ancient view of astronomy, and then read C.S. Lewis's cosmic trilogy of how he tries to bring together ancient and modern cosmology. But we're going to discuss that through there, right? This year, we're discussing the mathematics behind it, right? So mathematical models that help us explain the movement of the planets. And this is going to correspond to a precalculus course. What do you cover in precalculus? You study trigonometry and you introduce some of the basic ideas of calculus. Now, a lot of people, precalculus is going to be the last mathematics course they're ever going to take again because they walk away from it so frustrated. Because usually what it is a random grab bag of subjects you didn't cover in earlier math courses that you need for more advanced mathematics. So we're going to throw it all in here as a precalculus course. And it's totally random. Students hate it. They think they're terrible at math. And then they don't go on to calculus, even though anyone who's taking calculus can tell you calculus is so much easier than precalculus. That will be the same in this program. This precalculus course will be way harder than calculus. But I want to include all the concepts of precalculus in a coherent fashion of studying astronomy. So at least there's a purpose to it. It might be a bunch of random material that's difficult to understand, but at least we're going to have an aim that we're aiming at. It doesn't feel arbitrary anymore. All right. So we will start by studying the theories of Ptolemy's Almagest to introduce trigonometry. Right? So we're studying ancient astronomy, where they invented trigonometry to study ancient astronomy. Actually, the Babylonians invented trigonometry to study the stars. And honestly, I think probably in order to build the Ark, Noah probably would have needed trigonometry. So trigonometry probably goes back to before the flood. So that they could, right? Adam and Eve were told that the planets are to mark days and years and seasons. So it might have been that Adam and Eve were created with the knowledge of trigonometry. I don't know. But in any case, this was originally used to study the heavens. So we're going to use it there. But this will be done through an adapted version, since Ptolemy's notations are very outdated. He doesn't call these things sine and cosine. He uses a base 60 system to try and do this. That's all really confusing. So I want to create a modern adapted version of Ptolemy, so you understand how his theories work, understand the math behind them, using modern notations. So you can actually use the notation. Right. So then we will look at the use of conic sections for astronomy and Kepler, right? Switching from circles to ellipses. and then finally introduced the fundamental ideas of calculus through Newton's Principia. And the advantage of Newton's Principia is he invented calculus to write this book and explain the mathematics of astronomy that was developed by Kepler. But calculus is an entirely new concept. And so if he said, I'm going to prove these physical theories using calculus, well, calculus has not been well established yet. So no one's going to accept his theories if they're based on not well-established math. What was well-established math at that time? The well-established math of that time was geometry, both for Euclid and Descartes. And so he uses proofs from Euclid and then takes Descartes' algebraization of them to prove his theories, leading to the intuitions of calculus, while not explicitly giving calculus, right? And so I think this is a good introduction of the intuitions of calculus using geometry that they already will know. So most students would not be prepared to read something like Newton's Principia, but they wouldn't have a good grasp of classical geometry and Cartesian geometry. But our students will have just spent the last 2 years studying Euclidean and Cartesian geometry. So they'll be well prepared to dive into this, hopefully. And these works, we may need to adapt all of them. It may be that the original works are too difficult for a high school student. I think that's very likely. But I want to introduce the concepts and the types of proofs they're using to a high school audience using modern notations. All right, then calculus. So while not part of the main sequence, I readapted it now, it is part of the main sequence, but students don't have to take it, right? If they started algebra in 9th grade because they're not good at math, they're not going to get to this, and that's okay. Right? By astronomy, we've introduced all the fundamental philosophical principles of astronomy. But we'll get into calculus here, and we'll continue to use visual intuitions that we used in geometry to demonstrate the proofs of calculus. So if you go on YouTube, go to 3 Blue 1 Brown. It's a YouTube channel that does really good animations to explain math. He's a mathematician. He has a really excellent series called The Essence of Calculus, showing the geometry behind calculus. And so I would 100% integrate those videos into the curriculum to really understand what's going on here and why calculus works the way it does, not just as an arbitrary set of rules. I'd also count this for AP Calculus BC. AB and BC are almost the same curriculums. BC just has a tiny bit more, but BC counts for 2 semesters of college math. So all students have to do is, on the day set by the AP exam, go to their local public high school and go take the test. And as long as they pass that test, most colleges will already count them for 2 semesters of college math. So that will be really helpful to them. All right. And then getting into really advanced math. So if students are advanced enough students, so taking Algebra 1 by at least 7th grade should take this course. Usually we just go into even more advanced calculus, but I want to dive into the foundations of mathematics and do something more interesting, right? As we said earlier, right, we want something that's going to set the student apart for a college, make them more valuable than all these other students applying. So it will examine the foundations of mathematics, set theory, and survey higher mathematics. We'll dive into the philosophy. What are numbers? Right? How does this work? Right? And then we will read George Cantor to see the scholastic roots of the modern foundation of mathematics. As you read George Cantor, the guy who invented modern set theory, the basis of modern mathematics, in his main work laying out set theory, I can't remember the name of it, he actually starts citing like St. Thomas and other scholastics to justify his principles because they were being heavily attacked in his day. And he was called insane for his theories. But actually, a lot of his theories are rooted within classical philosophy. And so I want to show that I think he actually roots mathematics back in a classical way, even though that's very controversial. I know a lot of people who are interested in classical mathematics hate Cantor, but I like Cantor, so we'll be studying him. And right, what other high school student is going to be coming into it, applying to a college that they've taken a course in set theory? Right, this is normally a college level course. right? And it's not one that's taught in high schools almost anywhere in the world. But they will have set theory already. That's going to really set them apart. And the reason they most of the time can't study set theory is you need logic to study set theory. But our students have already taken formal logic, so they'll have a background in it. All right. I'm going to take a few minutes to get some more water, and I'm drinking some iced tea here. I'm going to get a bit more iced tea, so I'll be back in a minute or two. So don't leave the stream right now. All right, I'm back now. Hey, thanks for watching, Andy. Yeah, we're about to get into how rhetoric is going to be taught here in a second. I discussed rhetoric early on as well, if people want to go back and watch it. All right, yeah, so let's get back into this then. So, language arts. SBA's language arts program was based on the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. These are not 3 stages of learning, but 3 actual techniques which can be used to demonstrate what is true. Right? So I already explained how that works early on if people want to go back in and see that at the beginning of the stream. But all right, so grammar should have already been learned by high school. Right, so ideally they should have already done a bunch of practice of grammar in elementary and middle school. But the study of Latin helps reinforce it, right? So Latin will help reinforce that grammar study. The language arts program provides the study of logic and rhetoric. Since music is not included elsewhere in the curriculum, it has been included here. I couldn't figure out how to fit it into the mathematics program, so I just put it here on the list of courses. All right. So in addition to the ordinary coursework described, each year students will practice writing using the proto-gymnosmata developed by Romans to train orators. So the Romans had a whole system of 14 skills you had to have as an orator. And actually Memoria Press has developed a great series of books that are supposed to start in 4th grade and go up to 11th grade in learning how to write well and using these Roman skills. So I'm just going to use that. So along with the course, they'll have assigned coursework. And that will just be based on where they started. So ideally, I'd recommend just start those in 4th grade using Memoria Press's book. And they could use the advanced books to go here. Or if they haven't, we'll figure out how to get in the essential books of it in the courses here, using some extra time there. All right. So our first course will be logic. So this will be a study in formal and material logic. This will allow students to formulate valid arguments and analyze the arguments of others. Students will also practice composition as described above. Right, so they're going to be going into formal logic, and I mentioned earlier, if people want to look more at my thoughts on logic, I mentioned it earlier in the stream. We'll be using this book, likely, not guaranteed, but I think this book, The Trivium by Sister Miriam Joseph, where she really connects logic to language arts. So it's not just a series of symbol manipulation, but it's actually a way to study the real world. All right, so then rhetoric. Once we can formulate valid arguments, we need to present those arguments in convincing ways. In the first semester, we will study Aristotle's Rhetoric to learn the principles of rhetoric. In the second semester, we will read and analyze examples of rhetoric. I'm thinking especially we should dig into some of St. Paul's letters, right? We studied the theology in them. Why don't we also analyze the rhetoric within them? I think that would be great as well. And students will also practice composition as described above. Yeah. So where will you be doing this? So for those coming in, this is a project I've been working on for the last few months, and I'm going to continue to work on of developing an online homeschooling program for high schoolers. Now, this is not completed. It's barely even started now. This is just a general outline of what I want to do. But I wanted to put this out there to see feedback on it. What are people's thoughts on it? If someone's interested, please reach out to me in helping me develop some of these courses. And if you're a parent, please let me know as a parent if you would be interested in enrolling your kid in a program like this. Because I don't want to put in all this work if there's no demand for it at all, you know? But I want to make sure there's a demand for it. And see, parents are like, yes, I really want my kid in that. I think that would be great. Yeah, and you'll be doing lots of different stuff in rhetoric. It could be lots of different great stuff to read in rhetoric, you know, and that's why we'll introduce some great literature as well in this rhetoric course. Right, so then music. This is also one of the 7 classical liberal arts, so it should be included as well so that all 7 arts are taught. Now, this is not a theory. This is not a course in music appreciation. Right. Ideally, students should be being introduced to high quality music at home so they can have a good sense of music appreciation. This will assume they already have somewhat of a background in music appreciation. It would also be great if you taught them to like play an instrument or something like that, so they have some sense of how music works. This is going to be the mathematics and philosophy of music is what this course is in. So classical music theory is heavily focused on ratios and how sounds are produced. So math and science will also be included. Finally, this course will connect to the study of music and nature. Right. So when you read these classical authors, and they talk about how music made with sound is only one type of music. There's also the music of the soul, the proper relationship of the different parts of the soul and the virtues, and the relationship of the soul and the body that were in proper harmony. And the music of, they said the heavens, the movement of the heavenly spheres, but really more generally, the whole universe as this great musical whole. You see, for example, right in Tolkien, in the Silmarillion, where they sing the world into existence. And singing the world into existence is, I think, very connected to these classical views of music. I think Tolkien, he was very well versed in medieval literature, and I think he's really drawing on that theory there when he's working on that in the Silmarillion. That's another book I should figure out how to fit into this curriculum, the Silmarillion. I didn't put Lord of the Rings anywhere in the curriculum just because I assume students have already read The Lord of the Rings by middle school. What if I develop, as I said earlier, I'd like to develop out a middle and elementary school program once the high school program is done. And I'd probably include Lord of the Rings somewhere in middle school as a year of literature. All right, and then finally, apologetics and senior thesis. This course will apply the study of logic and rhetoric to the defense of the Christian faith. We will study arguments for God, for the Christian faith, and against heresies, right? So we've now studied everything in theology. We've taught them how to make good arguments and how to present those arguments. Now we're going to practice doing that using the teachings of the church and defending the teachings of the church. All right. In addition, rather than focusing on composition techniques, students will have to take their composition skills and knowledge learned in all their classes to present an original thesis paper on any topic of their choice related to the content learned at SBA. And they'll also have to defend that thesis to the staff, right, to the students there, to whatever teachers we have over video chat. This is something that's usually only done in college or graduate school, but I think with all this background, students will have learned how to write a good paper. They've had lots of practice in composition. And they've learned, think about all the subjects they can tie together: classical mathematics, classical science, theology, literature, history, right? They have all this background. They have so many different things they can write on, and they can tie together the different courses they've been looking at and apply those to it. And so, yeah, I think that this would be a great thing that they're going to get to do. And I think most students will have a lot of fun writing and presenting this paper, because they get to do pretty much anything so long as it's somewhat related. They'll have to send in a topic for their thesis for approval by whatever teacher is advising it. But pretty much anything, right? They can't just write on like their favorite TV show or something like that. But maybe they could if they have a TV show they like, and connect, and it's a good TV show of actual good quality, and compare it to something they've read. That would absolutely be a great topic for a thesis. You know, I think that there's so many different things they could do. And I think that the students will really have a lot of fun with this project. And I think this is a sort of project that like they remember from high school for the rest of their life. All right, so now Latin. All right, this is the last thing we're going to touch on. So SBA's Latin program has two purposes. The first and foremost purpose is to read Latin. So much important literature, Catholic literature, is in Latin, and it is essential that all Catholics learn Latin. So the most important thing is just they can read Latin. All right. In addition, the study of Latin will also help the study of grammar. Grammar is easier to analyze in another language than in your own. And in the future, SBA hopes to be able to offer Greek and Hebrew as well. I'd like to be able to get Greek and Hebrew, probably not good enough Greek and Hebrew that students can read like actual complex literature in Greek, but I think it would be good if students can come out having a basic ability to work their way through the Old and New Testaments in Greek and Hebrew. I think that would be excellent. That's something I'd love to develop in the future as well for this. But for starting off, we're just going to try and get Latin down well and get that really worked out. This will be the only required language. All right. So Latin 1 and 2. This course will serve as an introduction for students with no Latin background. Ideally, they should be studying Latin in like kindergarten, first grade, second grade. That's when you should be starting them with Latin. If they start with Latin when they're that young, instead of focusing so much on Latin in high school, then we can introduce them to Greek and Hebrew instead. But we're going to, and also they'll be able to read a lot more complex stuff here. So we want them to come in with that background. If you're trying to figure out right now, you're a parent, you're hearing this, and you say, all right, I want my student to have Latin. I'd highly recommend two basic things. Memoria Press's Latin program has an excellent program on grammar. And then there's also the Lingua Latina volumes that are good practice in reading simple Latin. It builds up to more and more difficult stuff. So if you have a young child interested in Latin, I'd highly recommend starting those right now. You've taught kindergarten Latin classes. That does sound like fun. I've taught Latin. I'm teaching Latin this year to a ninth grader. And honestly, if you want to learn Latin and you only have a little bit of Latin or no Latin background, you have kids, teach your kids Latin. That's how you will get your Latin skills to be much better. My Latin has improved this year more than any year of actually studying Latin in college, but I've had to teach Latin this year. And when you're teaching Latin, you have to be able to glance down at a sentence and just know what it means, because you don't want to have to try and break it down in the middle of class to everyone. So you really need a good Latin to just be able to look at it and read it. So teaching Henley 1 to a ninth grader has really helped improve my Latin. All right, but then ideally, right, we want to look at teaching Latin, right? So looking at how it aligns. So you have Latin 1, Latin 2 if they have no background. Then the Vulgate, because the Vulgate's very simple Latin to introduce them to some Latin. And then classical Latins. It's important to read classical Latin. That's the real good Latin is classical Latin. Even the medieval authors, they studied classical Latin to learn how to write good Latin. As soon as classical Latin learning became more widespread, that was the standard to write Latin. If people are interested in some of the history of this, in my recent interview with Ryan Grant, that's on my Patreon, we went into how the revival of classical Latin influenced St. Robert Bellarmine. Yeah, so I'd highly recommend that. But it is important to study classical Latin. But if they have a good enough Latin to read, it will actually match up with their studies. So the first year, as they're studying the Old Testament, they can read the Vulgate. As they're studying classical philosophy, they can study classical Latin. So probably it'll be Cicero first semester of classical philosophy, and then the Aeneid second semester. So as they read the Aeneid in English, they'll read some of the Aeneid in Latin as well. Then ecclesiastical Latin. So as they study theology, we're going to start off with St. Thomas, but St. Thomas is very simple Latin. It's a great starting point for ecclesiastical Latin. Then St. Bonaventure, because he's more complex, and maybe touch on St. Augustine, because he's very, very difficult, but that would be a good spot to go. Yeah. And Bonaventure and Augustine both have great Latin style, where St. Thomas doesn't, but he's also simple Latin, so it's good practice. Gregory Sadler, another guy here on YouTube, he said he actually pretty much taught himself Latin by working through the whole of St. Thomas's Summa in Latin, and that's also how he learned Thomism as well, because he was trying to study up on some medieval philosophy and was trying to improve his Latin skills, so he just read the Summa in Latin. That's how you know someone has dedication there. All right, and then finally, they would have Latin prose composition. The best way, I think, to learn Latin and how Latin actually works at a grammatical level is to practice writing Latin. So taking English and turning it into Latin. I learned more in my course on Latin prose composition than any other course I took on Latin in college. That was a really important course. And Bradley's Arnold is a great textbook for it. So we're going to be using Bradley's Arnold for that. All right. And yeah, that's everything in here. So first, I just want to plug my channel. So if you like this channel and you want to support it, you can support it on Patreon. Hopefully soon you'll be able to support it through Super Chats again. For some reason, Google AdSense isn't recognizing my bank account, so that's why there's no ads or Super Chats right now. I'm hoping to fix that up. Then yeah, but also you can just support it just by watching these videos. Helps out a ton. Be sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, comment below, share it on social media. If you like this, that really supports me. And yeah, if you're interested in this program, please reach out to me, whether you're just saying, you know, I'm an adult and I'd love to take some of the classes in this, or I have kids and I'd love to get them enrolled, or I wish there was a program like this when my kids were around. Or I think you should do this in the program, or I am really knowledgeable on this subject and I'd love to help you develop this curriculum. Anything even somewhat related to all of this whole talk, I really, really would like that. So please, if you have anything like that, please reach out to me and help me out with this project. Especially just in general, I think, on if people are interested in a program like this, because I'd love to gauge some interest on it as well. And so, yeah, thank you everyone for watching and have a good day.